Hi, I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. Today, we conclude our three-part discussion and reading of Washington Irving's famous tale, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's quite a long read for a short story, honestly, but as we've explored both Irving's life and the story, I hope you've learned to appreciate a little bit of the mythology and cultural heritage that have emerged on the American continent and made their way into American cultural history. In episode 1, we discussed in part the life of Washington Irving, the context in which he lived and wrote, and read the first part of our story. In that first part, we met our comedic protagonist, Ichabod Crane. I mean, he's awkward and goofy, and his name is awkward and goofy. And he's really childlike. He's a school teacher who has come to live in Sleepy Hollow, a little village not far from Tarrytown, New York. In episode 2, we introduced the other important characters in our narrative, specifically Katrina Von Tassel and Brom Bones. We learned that Ichabod Crane is interested in marrying Katrina, but maybe perhaps not for the right reasons. He's in love with her farm, and he dreams of all the food from the farm and how much of it he could eat if he were its owner. And we meet Ichabod's romantic rival, Brom Bones, who, unfortunately for Ichabod, is big and burly and courageous and quite the prankster. And he, as well as his friend group, often harass Ichabod as a way of discouraging him from pursuing Katrina, a task he does by volunteering to give her singing lessons, of all things.
Well, when we ended the last episode, we were at the Van Tassel's mansion because Ichabod had been invited to a quilting party. Everyone was there. There's lots of food. There's dancing. Beautiful women. Oh, and did I mention there was food? That's where we stopped. Today we'll begin reading where we left off at Katrina's party. But before we do, it would be interesting, I think, to veer into some real history just for a moment. This time, America's literary history from this time period for what it was. We've already mentioned that America had basically zero writers of note before Irving. But Gary, what's interesting about this era as it might affect those of us that are interested in cultural history and things that people write about?
Well, as we have discussed, the sketchbook was published in 1820, and that's around 40-plus years after the Declaration of Independence. So pretty early on from when America achieved nationhood and, for the most part, had repaired its relationship with the motherland. There were still tensions in the Florida area and perhaps in a few places out west. But besides that, the American and British people were creating a new cultural identity together, or at least that's from the American perspective. In one sense, America was a new nation and as such had little cultural heritage of its own. We didn't have many traditions. Remember, Thanksgiving wasn't even declared a national holiday until Abraham Lincoln's day, and America didn't have really any legends or cultural distinctives, or very few, at least not like the Europeans did with their fairies and their trolls and their dragons and all the other heroes and knights that populated their music and stories. But in another sense, those who were writing in English were coming from a place with a rich cultural heritage, namely Europe. So as Gertrude Stein put it, we were the old people in a new world, the new people made out of the old. And this dynamic made for some peculiar ideas about literature. One idea was that the American people should completely avoid fiction reading and writing altogether. In 1810, Reverend James Gray, a trustee from the Philadelphia Academy for Ladies, gave a speech that was somewhat famous, titled Female Education, where he argued in front of the student body and many guests that it was time to put away novels and other forms of fiction. He said fiction was good for the very transient period of childhood where the mind is itself the region of fiction, of hopes and fears, and plans and projects far beyond the narrow limits of sober reality. Childhood was a time for ghosts and goblins and enchanted castles, but as one matures, all of this should be put away for what he calls more substantial food. He said adults demand fact and doctrine, and adults should assume their place in the actual world. So in other words, we shouldn't be reading or writing fiction at all. It's a childish thing to do.
Well, I guess he would not really have liked much of what Washington Irving was writing.
No, indeed. But his opinion was very much in line with what all academia was preaching at the time. And this was the conventional wisdom. This was the view of the mainstream academics. The British essayist William Hazlitt wrote a famous essay titled, "Why the Arts Are Not Progressive." The intellectuals of the day saw great art as the stuff of primitive society. It was a childish society that produced stories, and the proof of high culture was a society that renounced such childish things for the sciences.
Well, in a sense, we do see that idea in this story. I mean, there isn't anyone more childish than Ichabod Crane, and he is the one telling stories, him and the old ladies that share all the ghost stories.
Exactly. Irving is kind of hyperbolizing through these characters what many people thought at the time, that stories were the things of old people and children. However, at the same time, it's also interesting that as much as these men railed against fiction, Irving was amassing a personal fortune selling stories. In fact, his stories financed a very nice lifestyle abroad for 17 years.
Well, Irving was the very first, let me point out, American to support himself entirely through his writing. And I will say he didn't just write fiction, although that's what we know him for today. He wrote biographies, and some of them were really reputable, like the one that he wrote about Christopher Columbus, and he wrote another one about the Prophet Muhammad. But after all those years in Europe, one of the things that he did with his money was buy this old fixer-upper house and create out of it what he was going to call, or what would be really his dream home. He called the place Sunnyside, and he loved it. He spent the first year renovating it, but then he spent the rest of the year just updating and improving it. He called it his folly. But I want to read what he wrote in a letter about it when he first bought it. He said, and I quote, "It's a beautiful spot, capable of being made a little paradise. There is a small stone Dutch cottage on it, built from a century since and inhabited by one of the Van Tassels. I have had an architect up there and shall build upon the old mansion this summer. My idea is to make a little nookery somewhat in the Dutch style, quaint but unpretending." Well, you can go and see it. Today it's a museum and you can visit it. It's in town, appropriately called Irvington. But in Irving's day, it was a place called Tarrytown. That's the general area where the story is set. Sunnyside is less than 3 miles from the place where Ichabod Crane supposedly is going to run into the headless horseman.
There's something else I wanted to say about this area. Did you notice the name of the person he bought the house from? It's the name from our story, Van Tassel. Irving did not just make up this name. This was a common name in the Tarrytown area, and in fact, he certainly knew several Van Tassels. So there was the Van Tassels who owned the house he bought, but we don't think that's the Van Tassel that inspired our story. There's another real-life Van Tassel that local tradition suggests is the inspiration for the story. Elizabeth Van Tassel, who owned what was called at the time the Elizabeth Van Tassel House. The house is not there today, but if you go to Tarrytown, you will find a commemorative plaque that marks the place where once stood the Elizabeth Van Tassel House. And Elizabeth Van Tassel lived in a house that carried her name during the Revolutionary War. Elizabeth sold the house at some point to the Mott family, who converted it into a tavern and boarding house. And Washington Irving's sister boarded there. Washington Irving went there all the time. He met lots of Van Tassels, and he heard who knows what kinds of stories there. And the name of the tavern was the Mott Tavern, but local people called the place the Old Elizabeth Van Tassel House. Originally, the house was on a 145-acre farm owned by a man named John Van Tassel. So bottom line, as Irving sat in the tavern and hung out with his sister, he absolutely learned the history of that house, and who knows where the inspiration from Katrina or this particular story came from.
Well, let's go there and visit it on the night that Ichabod Crane is there before.
Boost Mobile is now sending experts nationwide to deliver and set up customers' new phones.
Wait, we're going on tour?
We're delivering and setting up customers' phones. It's not a tour.
Not with that attitude.
Introducing Store to Door. Switch and get a new device with expert setup and delivery.
Delivery available for select devices purchased at boostmobile.com.
From holiday hosting to unforgettable gifts, Omaha Steaks delivers the world's best steak experience. Gift family and friends USDA certified tender steaks, juicy burgers, cozy and convenient comfort meals, and so much more. Save big on gourmet gifts and more holiday favorites with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide during their Sizzle All the Way sale. And for an extra $35 off, use promo code HOLIDAY at checkout. Terms apply. See site for details. That's omahasteaks.com, code HOLIDAY.
Big news! Boost Mobile is now sending experts nationwide to deliver and set up customers' new phones at home or work.
Wait, we're going on tour?
Not a tour. We're delivering and setting up customers' phones so it's easier to upgrade.
Let's get in the tour bus and hit the road.
No, not a tour bus. It's a regular car we use to deliver and set up customers' phones at home or work.
Are you a groupie on this tour?
We deliver and set up phones. It's not a tour.
Oh, you're definitely a groupie.
Introducing Store to Door. Switch and get a new device with expert setup and delivery wherever you're at.
Delivery available for select devices purchased at boostmobile.com.
It was converted into a tavern, and see what happens on the night of Katrina's quilting party.
Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped-up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tenderer oliekoek, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. Then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover, delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy together, much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its cloud of vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark! I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty.
So in other words, he ate everything. And we're reminded that as much as Ichabod loves Katrina, I think he might love food a little bit more.
He was a kind and thankful creature whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all the scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans van Ripper and every other patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of doors that should dare to call him comrade. Old Baltus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned to the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed Negro who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple were to start.
And so after the music starts and Ichabod has eaten clearly as much as he wants, if that's possible, he will begin dancing. Now remember, Ichabod fancies himself a great singer, but he also fancies himself a great dancer. Last episode, we talked about how we as as readers, we're led by the narrator not to really take Ichabod seriously. And we're really not supposed to take our narrator's descriptions of Ichabod seriously. We call it burlesque. It's when it's meant to be funny, but it's written in somewhat a serious way. But everything is silly. Everything's exaggerated, and that's what we see. Ichabod is ridiculous, but he takes himself very seriously, and he really believes that everyone else does too. Our narrator describes Ichabod as this master of the dance floor. And of course, that's what Ichabod thinks. But we, as clever readers, might visualize something a lot more ridiculous. Something like him throwing around these girls during the waltz, stepping on their toes, that sort of thing. We also might find it hard to believe, the part that I'm getting ready to read in a minute, where it says that Brom Bones is jealous of Ichabod. How could he be? Either way, it's kind of funny to imagine how Ichabod must look to the other people at the party. And of course, after the dancing ends, the men will sit around and tell their heroic exploits from the Revolutionary War. These, I'm sure, were also highly exaggerated renditions of what actually happened. But after the war stories, as the night goes onward, we're going to get into conversations that will descend into ghost stories. So I'll pick up the reading and read this description of the party as we see Ichabod take the dance floor. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the Negroes who, having gathered of all ages and sizes from the farm in the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their eyeballs and showing grinning rows of teeth from ear to ear. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all of his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of sager folks, who with old Von Tassel sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood at the time of which I am speaking was one of those highly favored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war, and it had therefore been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and in the indistinctness of his recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dofu Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old 9-iron pounder from a mud breastwork, only with his gun burst at the 6th discharge. There was an old gentleman, who shall be nameless, being too rich a mariner to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, inasmuch that he absolutely felt it whiz around the blade and glance off at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to its happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, but are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves into their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood. So that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintance left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why so seldom we hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on night times before the storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the headless horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard.
Let me interrupt because now we have a bit of real history being injected into the story. In fact, since Washington Irving set his story in a real place, it would almost have been inappropriate for him not to mention a few of the real ghosts that people believed, or maybe still believe, really inhabit Sleepy Hollow. So he mentions Major Andre. Actually, Irving mentions Major Andre 3 times in the story. Major Andre is a real historical character of some importance in the story of the Revolutionary War. He was a major in the British Army and head of British intelligence. In other words, he was a spy. And in his role, he was the liaison between Benedict Arnold and the British Army. So for those who may not recognize that name, Benedict Arnold was actually an American hero at one point. In fact, at one point, he was the most celebrated general in the American Army. He had been successful at the Battle of Ticonderoga, which is the first big American success. But as the war wore on, Arnold got disillusioned. He thought the British were going to win, and he decided to switch sides, and he reached out to the British who were offering them information that would help them in the war and finish off the Americans. So on September 21st, 1780, Arnold and Major Andre met secretly. Arnold gave Major Andre critical documents about the American strategy, maps and troop movements and everything. The information Arnold gave Major could have really doomed the American Revolution. However, Andre got stranded on the western shore of the Hudson River, and he got caught by the American militia.
Oops.
Yeah, he was the bad timing. He was tried for being a spy, and he was hanged on October 2nd at the age of 28. The American secrets were safe, but according to the legend that Irving is referring to here, Major Andre is still trying to finish his job and get those plans back to the British. To this day, he wanders the area around Tarrytown on horseback. According to legend, he doesn't haunt the site of his execution, but instead he haunts the place where he was caught, which was in Tarrytown. And there is actually a monument today that marks the spot where Major Andre was hanged. But if you go to Tarrytown, you can go to the bridge where Major Andre perhaps is still riding, trying to complete his mission. And it is said that if you're quiet, it is still possible to hear the galloping of his horse at night.
Oh, my. Well, can we assume that the woman in white is a real person, too?
She is, although not as famous. The ghost story is that there is a woman who wandered out looking for shelter in a snowstorm. She got caught and died at this place called Raven Rock. So, yes, there really are lots of real ghost stories in Tarrytown, and Ichabod was not wrong to be a little spooked. I mean, I think lots of people have been spooked there over the years. It's a spooky place.
Well, I'm spooked. I'm not even there. But let me pick up the reading and let's watch what Ichabod does and how he gets spooked. So the sequestered situation of this church seemed always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its descends whitewashed walls shine modestly forth like Christian purity, beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon this grass-grown yard where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there at least the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. On a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself was thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. This was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obligated to get up behind him, how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge, where the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. Well, this story was immediately matched with the thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from his neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by the midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch. And he would have won, too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. Well, all these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenance of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up, and the old farmers gathered together their families and their wagons, and were heard for some time riding along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoing along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he now was on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no great interval with an air quite desolate and chop-fallen. Oh, these women, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roast rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable with his severely hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corns and oats, and whole valleys of timothy and clover.
So let's clarify what's just happened here. The party breaks up. Ichabod stays behind to talk to Katrina. The narrator doesn't know what they said to each other, but all we do know is that Ichabod leaves the party sad, silent, and alone.
And kicking his horse.
Yes.
Exactly. And the text says that he leaves at witching hour. Now, traditionally, that's the hour between midnight and 1 a.m. So
here's how to stay alive longer so you can enjoy Boost Mobile's unlimited plan with a price that never goes up. Do not mistake a wasp nest for a piñata. Stay alive and switch now at Boost Mobile. After 30 gigs, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Mobile Unlimited plan.
How does F1 turn data into insights at 200 miles per hour? AWS is how fans get inside the strategy. AWS powers next-level innovation for millions of businesses.
that's pretty late to be leaving a party if you have to go into the woods after listening to ghost stories all night.
Indeed. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travel homewards along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor under the land. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from this faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far off from some farmhouse away from the hills, but it was like the dreaming sound in his ear. No signs of life occurred to him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by, and was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and he ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was the identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful all the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears decreased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. All was in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes.
So Ichabod goes through the woods to the place where Major Andre got captured, and he is officially spooked. So he's going to try to get Gunpowder, his noble steed, except not, to go. Let's read what happens after all these kicks.
The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a splashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, black, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up therefore a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for the strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with a galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of the fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started full jump with him.
So let's again stop and revisit what's happened. The headless horseman has approached Ichabod. And what's worse than that, there at the end, we notice that the headless horseman is carrying his head on the saddle. Ichabod kicks the sides of the horse, and he tries his best to get Gunpowder to move. I'll pick up the reading. Away then they dashed, through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lanky body over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow. But Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up with it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads into a sandy hollow, shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the famous bridge and goblin story, and just beyond the swells of Green Knoll, on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold to it firm, but in vain, and just had time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and an unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghost competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach the bridge, thought Ichabod, I'm safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to the rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. But just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind.
So Ichabod falls off the horse, and then the headless horseman throws his head at Ichabod. I mean, that's pretty aggressive.
I know, and now Ichabod's stuck, running for his life.
The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road and evidently at furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined a bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair of 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of fool scrap, much scribbled and blotted, in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tessel. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good to come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in a churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and the pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower of Bones and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead.
Well, Ichabod disappears. But what happened? Well, it's not totally explained. We, as readers, have to look at the evidence and determine, did the horseman really get Ichabod? Did Ichabod, who had his money, just run away? Did he die? But if he did, where is his body? Did Brom Bones do something? Let's finish it out. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, and that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin in Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, and he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school, studied law at the same time, and had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspaper, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Bron Bones, too, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it's a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and is reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. And the plowboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distant, chanting, melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.
It's a mystery, although there are rumors that Ichabod Crane is now a working lawyer. I mean, not wanting to come back to Sleepy Hollow out of embarrassment, as we can all understand.
Oh, it's a fun way to end the story. And of course, we cannot forget the way that this story is written. It's not written as a fictional tale, although it is. It's written as history, something serious, something mature, not like one of those childish novels the women folk are so fond of reading. But even if it is a true story, as the narrator supposes that it might be, that doesn't mean that the narrator doesn't want to leave us with a moral lesson of instruction. What can we learn? What important lesson can we learn from this story? So if you missed the tale and you didn't get the subtext, in the epilogue, he explicitly reminds us, we read it last episode, but let's read it again. The words of wisdom that we are to glean. Let me quote. There is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided we will but take a joke as we find it. That, therefore, he that runs races with goblin troopers is likely to have rough riding of it.
He that runs races with goblin troopers is likely to have rough riding of it. All right, note to self, I'm going to write that down. I mean, I guess that's good advice. I'll avoid that.
I think it is.
So there you have it, one of America's first legends, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. We hope you enjoyed our reading and our explanation from this great story writer. If you did, hit like on your podcast feed or on our YouTube channel. Also, please recommend this episode and our podcast to your friends and students. Forward it to somebody who might enjoy it. And, of course, subscribe and follow us on all of our social media pages, or you can visit us at howtoloveitpodcast.com. Be sure to like this episode on your podcast, YouTube, and subscribe. Thank you for sharing with us on our mission to make studying the English language and literature accessible and enjoyable for as many people as possible.
Peace out.
The longer you stay alive, the longer you can enjoy Boost Mobile's unlimited plan with a price that never goes up. So here are some tips. Do not parallel park on a cliff if you want to enjoy an unlimited plan with a price that never goes up. Do not mistake a wasp nest for a piñata if you want to enjoy an unlimited plan with a price that never goes up. Do not microwave a hard-boiled egg if you want to enjoy an unlimited plan with the price that never goes up. Stay alive and enjoy unlimited wireless for $25 a month forever with Boost Mobile. After 30 gigs, customers may experience lower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Mobile Unlimited plan.
From holiday hosting to unforgettable gifts, Omaha Steaks delivers the world's best steak experience. Gift family and friends USDA certified tender steaks, juicy burgers, cozy and convenient comfort meals, and so much more. Save big on gourmet gifts and more holiday favorites with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide during their Sizzle All the Way sale. And for an extra $35 off, use promo code HOLIDAY at checkout. Terms apply. See site for details. That's omahasteaks.com, code HOLIDAY.
Parles-tu français?
¿Hablas español?
Parli italiano?
If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based technique teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Acast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Acast. Rules and restrictions may apply.